History, they tell us, is written by the victors. But what of the losers? And what of the forgotten, the erased, the deliberately silenced? Between the fall of Rome in the 5th century and the flowering of the medieval kingdoms in the 10th, there lies a shadow, a silence in the record, a wound in memory. Historians mark it as a dark age, a time of chaos, migration, plague, and collapse. Yet within that silence, there are whispers of something far stranger, something not found in the polished textbooks of empires, but only in the fragile margins of burnt manuscripts, in rumors carried down by peasants who swore their grandfathers saw things never written again. It begins, as so many stories do, with a throne. Not a throne of gold or iron, not a jeweled seat for popes or emperors, but a throne of ash-black wood, wood that did not rot, wood that could not burn. A throne described in whispers as older than Christendom, older even than Rome, carved from a tree that never grew in any known forest. The Ashen Throne, the Vanishing Kingdom. A monk writing in the Abbey of Fulda around the year 820 wrote a single strange sentence in the middle of a page otherwise devoted to psalms. I saw a city that burned, though it was never built. The line makes no sense. Scholars dismiss it as metaphor or as the fevered scribble of a delirious scribe. Yet this same phrase appears again nearly a century later in a manuscript from Worms. They saw cities that burned, though they were never built. What city burns but was never built? And why would two monks, separated by distance and time, write the same impossible phrase? It is here that the story of the Ashen Throne first emerges. The empire, if it may be called that, seems to have stood not in the light of history, but in its shadow. The records are scattered, fragmented, stitched together from rumors and forbidden texts. One chronicles it as Regnum Cineres, the Kingdom of Ash. Another calls it Imperium Nollis, the Empire of No One. No maps show its borders. No coins carry its king's name. Yet descriptions remain, tantalizing in their consistency. An empire of fortresses that rose from the earth overnight, of markets that appeared and vanished like smoke, of riders who moved without sound across the fields, and of a throne that anchored them, all a throne no fire could consume. The throne itself is always described in the same way. Ash-black, streaked like burnt wood, yet unscarred by flame. One monk claims it was carved from the stump of a tree struck by lightning in the age before. Noah, another, insists it was made from the heartwood of a tree that grew in hell itself. And yet, the throne was not an ornament. It was a seat of power. Rulers sat upon it, though their names are lost. Some texts call them the silent sovereign, the king of none, the emperor without name. No one describes their face. No one dares. It is as if to speak his name, more hers was to give the empire life again. In one fragment, a Byzantine envoy describes visiting a northern stronghold, where he saw a chair of wood, blacker than coal, shining faintly as if with embers. When he asked whose throne it was, the locals fell silent. One old man whispered, "It waits." The cities that shouldn't be the empire cities were strangers still. Peasant legends tell of markets that appeared overnight. A merchant caravan would stumble upon a bustling town filled with traders, goods, and taverns. They would trade, drink, feast. But when dawn came, the town was gone, replaced by empty fields, or forest, or a plain of scorched earth. A German folk tale preserved in the 12th century speaks of a farmer who found himself within the gates of such a city. He drank wine sweeter than any he had ever tasted. He touched walls smooth as marble. He heard bells ring in towers that gleamed with gold. But when he awoke the next morning, he lay in an open meadow, his clothes blackened with soot, his lips cracked with thirst. In his hands he clutched not gold coins, but ashes. Excavations centuries later uncovered foundations in remote valley stone, laid in precise patterns, as though for fortresses or castles, but they show no signs of long habitation. Some are half melted, as if the stones were exposed to heat so intense that they wept and fused together. And always the soil around them is barren, as though nothing will grow. The locals call these ruins the dust cities. Why erased a T? If this empire existed, why do we not know of it? Why do no chronicles record its kings, its battles, its victories? Why is its throne remembered only in whispers? There is one possibility. Perhaps it was never meant to be remembered. The Catholic Church, in its rise to power, burned countless texts deemed heretical. Yet the fragments of the Ashen Throne are different. They are not condemned directly. They are ignored, blacked out, blotted into silence. A monk in 1066 wrote, "I must not write of the riders who came in silence. I must not write of the throne. It is forbidden." Then the page ends. What was so terrifying that even to describe it was forbidden? The shadow between empires, Rome fell. Byzantium endured. The Franks rose, a teen between these powers. In the silence of the so-called Dark Ages, there may have been another power. A power without a name. A power that did not build to last, but built to vanish. A kingdom of smoke and cinder. When historians look at the 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries, they see emptiness. Lost years, broken records. They blame chaos, migration, plague. But what if it was not chaos? What if it was order, too terrible to survive in memory? Perhaps the empire of the Ashen Throne thrived in those years. Perhaps its riders swept across the land unseen. Perhaps its throne ruled where no throne should. And perhaps its erasure was deliberate. Echoes in folklore in rural Poland. Villagers once refused to cut down blackened trees, believing them to be cursed remnants of the Ashen Throne's forests. In Saxony, ballads speak of riders who came without hoofbeats, whose eyes glowed with embers. In Hungary, a prayer warns children not to speak of the emperor who waits. Even today, in certain valleys, farmers will not plow the soil, claiming it drinks blood. Coincidence? Or memory twisted, faint, but still alive? The Chronicler of Worms left us with fragments, whispers of a kingdom without dawn, a kingdom that seemed to march across the edges of known maps like a shadow swallowing candlelight. But what is a whisper in parchment compared to the weight of stone? In valleys forgotten by history narrow, windless basins cut between mountain spines, there lie the remains of fortresses so vast, so deliberate in their design, that they should have changed the way we understand medieval Europe. And yet, they do not appear in any chronicle, any royal ledger, any war account. They are ruins without fathers, walls without builders. Archaeologists stumbling across them in the 18th and 19th centuries gave them a name born not of science, but of despair. They called them the dust cities, not because they were made of dust, but because when one enters them, when one walks along the toppled foundations, one finds only silence and an air that tastes of ash. The stones themselves are scarred not by sword or ram, not by the iron bite of siege, but by fire. Whole walls, tens of meters thick, are scorched black as if a storm of flame rolled over them. Yet, when the masonry is examined, there are no cracks of impact, no signs of struggle. It is as if the walls themselves caught fire from within. And the soil, the soil, always the soil. Peasants who live in the surrounding hills refuse to plant their crops within a mile of these ruins. They say the soil drinks blood, not as a metaphor, but as a fact. Livestock that graze too near grow thin, their bones brittle. Seeds planted sprout too quickly, unnaturally, and then rot before harvest. The peasants tell their children, do not play among the stones, for the earth beneath remembers more than you do, and they are right. Excavations reveal that beneath these blackened walls lie layers of bone, not carefully buried, not reverently placed, but scattered, broken, mingled with the ash. Skulls fused with melted stone, rib cages warped by heat. Skeletons of children curled beside the carcasses of oxen all turn to powder at the touch. Whatever happened here was not war as we know it. It was not famine nor pestilence. It was annihilation. And yet, no chronicle mentions it. Think of that for a moment. Fortresses that must have taken tens of thousands of hands to build, erased so cleanly that only folklore remains. The monks of Worms spoke of a kingdom where the night never ended. Could these dust cities have been its station's outposts of a power that walked between dusk and dawn, never seen in the clear light of day? The folklore suggests so. Old songs sung in the dialects of shepherds whisper of phantom torches seen at night upon the walls, though no walls stand. Peasants claim that if you stand in the valleys on a windless evening, you can hear the tramp of feet upon gravel roads that no longer exist. Even the animals know it. Horses refuse to enter. Dogs whimper at the boundary stones. Only the crows perch on the ruins, silent as if remembering a feast of corpses too plentiful to forget. And always there is the ash. Sift the soil and your fingers come away black. Ash that is not wood. Ash that holds fragments of bone too small to see, yet sharp enough to cut. The land itself has become a grave, a pyre without end. But why no record? Why would the annals of Europe, so eager to note the battles of kings and the plagues of cities, fall utterly silent here? Some scholars suggest censorship, that these ruins belonged to a kingdom erased deliberately from history. Others whisper something darker, that the chroniclers did not write of it because they were afraid that by writing, they would call it back. There is a story told in hushed tones of a Franciscan friar in the 13th century who set his ink to describe one of these dust cities. He drew its walls, its towers, the black glassy stones that seemed melted like candle wax. But when he awoke the next morning, the parchment was blank. His writing, his sketches, all gone burned away, as if by invisible fire. The friar tried again, and again the parchment turned black overnight. On the third attempt, he is said to have lost his sight entirely. His last words, dictated to another monk, were simple: "The stone does not wish to be remembered." And so they were forgotten. Forgotten by kings, forgotten by scribes, left only in the mouths of peasants who spoke of the dust cities as places where one does not linger, places where the soil drinks blood. But if we step back, we view these ruins not as isolated curiosities, but as points upon a hidden map. Another shape emerges. Each dust city lies along a line, a great arc that cuts through the heart of Europe and beyond. They are not random. They are stations, outposts, silent markers of an empire erased. Could this have been the empire of the Ashen Throne? An empire that burned its own cities to ash, rather than allow them to fall into enemy hands? Or were these not cities at all, but sacrifices, ritual pyres, so vast that their smoke blackened the sky for days? No one knows. No one dares to know. And yet, when the wind hauls through these valleys, carrying with it the taste of ash, one begins to understand why the peasants do not plant, why they do not build. For the land remembers, and the land hungers. The dust cities stand as a monument not to the triumph of men, but to their erasure. They are crossroads where history, superstition, and silence merge into one. And if you listen long enough, if you dare to breathe that ash-laden air, you may hear the whisper of armies that once marched without torches, guided only by the stars. Armies that left behind not glory, but dust.
The first whisper, the Chronicler of Worms, in the year 1022, in the quiet cloisters of Worms, a Benedictine monk sat bent over parchment. His name is lost, to us perhaps, deliberately erased, perhaps simply forgotten, but his words, fragile and broken, remain. The manuscript he produced was no grand chronicle of kings, no glorious account of battles won. It was a whisperer, warning tucked between prayers and copied scripture, a voice straining to speak in a world that demanded silence. On one of the surviving fragments, half burned, he wrote, "To the east, where the night never ends, there lies a kingdom." What did he mean? The kingdom where the night never ends? Scholars argue over his meaning. Was it poetic metaphor, a reference to the long winters of the north, a vision of the afterlife? Or was he describing something else, entirely an empire cloaked in literal darkness? The monk continues. They march without fire. Their armies do not need the torch, for they follow the stars, and the stars themselves bend to their way. Here, the fragments grow more disturbing. He describes battalions of soldiers moving silently through fields at night, their armor glinting like frost, their faces hidden beneath veils. He says they carried no banners, no crests, no signs of kingship, only black cloth, unmarked, fluttering like shrouds in the wind. Most chilling of all, he writes, where their feet pass, the earth is hollow. Where their breath falls, the air grows thin. The censor's hand. This manuscript did not survive whole. Entire passages are blotted out with thick black strokes, so heavy the parchment tore beneath them. Others are scorched, as though the page itself was held over a flame, until its ink blistered and ran. Yet the censor did not destroy the text completely. Why? Perhaps the church did not want the words read, yet feared that their total erasure would draw more questions than their silence. Better to scar the pages, to leave fragments of forbidden history buried inside psalms and prayers. In one burned margin, just legible through the charring, is a single phrase: "Beware the riders of ash. They come in silence, but they do not come unseen." The life of the chronicler. Who was this monk of Worms? No name is attached to the surviving fragments, but clues remain. The handwriting suggests a scribe trained in the Benedictine style, steady, practiced. Notes on saints' feast days show he lived within the orders, strict rhythm bells, prayers, fasts, silence. And yet, into this silence, he inserted words that broke all rules. Why risk writing them at all? Why record what he must have known was dangerous? Perhaps he had seen something. Perhaps travelers came through worms, bearing stories too vivid, too consistent to ignore. Perhaps the monk himself glimpsed something in the eastern forests. A procession at night, soldiers without torches, their path lit only by the cold light of the stars. Or perhaps more chilling still, he did not write his own words at all, but copied them from a far older text, one already suppressed, one carrying the weight of centuries of forbidden memory, armies of darkness. The image he leaves us is unforgettable. Armies moving by starlight, never lighting torches. In medieval times, armies lived and died by fire. Torches lit their way. Campfires kept men warm, kept beasts at bay. Without fire, an army was blind, vulnerable, lost. To march without it was unthinkable. And yet, the chronicler insists, these armies had no need of flame. He says, they see where we see not. They walk in night, as if in day. The stars are their torches, and the stars obey them. Was this poetry? Or did he describe something real soldiers who could navigate in darkness with unnatural precision? One theory among occult historians suggests the Ashen Throne's armies were trained to fight by starlight alone, guided by constellations, drilled until they could march in silence, their eyes adjusted to night. Another, darker theory claims they carried with them relic stones, or idols that glowed faintly, lights not of flame but of some other power, long since lost. The chronicler himself offers no explanation. He only warns, when they come, you will not hear their steps. You will see them only when it is too late. Echoes of fear. The strangest part of the worm's fragments is not what the monk describes, but how he writes. His words are not those of a storyteller, nor of a prophet. They are the words of a man afraid. His sentences trail off, stop abruptly, begin again as if he dared not commit all to parchment. In one passage he writes, they, then the ink blotches, the quill clearly lifted in haste. Below, half a line later, and so the bells rang, though no man pulled them. What terrified him so much that he could not finish his thought? The blackened pages. Centuries later, when scholars uncovered this manuscript in a worm's library, they found most of its pages defaced. Monastic censors had dragged thick black ink across entire paragraphs, blotting them from history. In some places, the ink was so violently applied that the parchment tore, leaving holes where words had once been. But ink fades. Fire scars parchment, but does not always consume it. With careful light, scholars have been able to read beneath the blackness. One passage, almost completely erased, reads, "The throne waits in the east. It is black as night, but it is not empty. There sits he who does not speak. There sits he who rules the armies of ash, even censored, even scarred. The shadow of the Ashen Throne emerges once again." The legacy of the Whisper, the Chronicler of Worms, is not the only monk to write of such things, but he is the first whose words survive, even in fragments. His testimony sets the stage for what will follow. Cities that burned, though never built, armies without banners, a throne that cannot burn. He was not a historian. He was not a king, or a soldier, or a traveler. He was a quiet man in a cloister, scratching ink onto parchment by candlelight. And yet, his voice carries across the centuries, whispering of an empire erased. Perhaps he lied. Perhaps he dreamed. Or perhaps he spoke the truth. In the silence of history, sometimes only whispers remain. And in 1022, in Worms, a monk dared to whisper of the empire where the night never ends.
The Black Banner campaigns. If the dust cities were monuments to annihilation, then the Black Banner campaigns were its echo in motion armies that should never have existed, marching across a continent that seems determined to forget them. The first mentions are brief, almost embarrassed, cocked into the margins of monastic chronicles, as if the writers themselves doubted what they were recording. A monk in Saxony, writing in 1047, describes legions without crest or standard, bearing banners blacker than the night. Another, in Lombardy, writes of columns upon columns, but with no king's name attached, no herald to announce them. And yet the ruins remain. Scattered across valleys and plains are the charred husks of villages that do not appear in any tax record, in any feudal roll. Entire settlements reduced to ash and bone as if swallowed by fire. Excavations reveal mass grave spits of skeletons hastily covered, their arms and skulls twisted in ways that suggest panic more than battle. But curiously, no weapons remain. No arrowheads, no swords, no shattered shields. The people were killed, but not fought, as though the killers themselves left nothing behind. This silence gives rise to the name by which folklore remembers them, the Riders of Ash, eyewitness tales. Preserved in oral tradition, speak of endless columns moving by night. Soldiers clad in simple, dark garb. No torches, no horns, no banners, save one. Long cloths of pure black, fluttering not in the wind, but against it has, if the flags consumed the very air. The peasants whispered, "The black flag eats the wind." It is difficult to overstate how terrifying the absence of a symbol was. In the medieval world, banners were everything. A crest declared loyalty, lineage, even divine favor. But the black banners bore nothing. They denied identity, denied meaning. To see them crest a hill was to see the promise of erasure. You would not know who killed you, nor why, nor for whose glory. You would only know that death had arrived, faceless, and still the chronicles are quiet. The great histories of the period, those written in courts, in abbeys, in universities, make no mention of these campaigns. It is as if entire wars were fought and buried in silence. And yet, there is a pattern. When one lays out the fragments reports of villages found burnt, chronicles that cautiously note armies without heraldry, folk tales of riders of Ashen Empire begins to appear. From the Rhine to the Carpathians, from the Black Sea to the steppes beyond, the campaigns move in sweeping curves. Not straight lines of conquest, but arcs, as though drawing circles upon the map. They do not seize cities, nor claim thrones. They pass through, leaving fire and silence in their wake, and vanish, always vanish. And that is the most unsettling part. The vanishing. Armies are heavy things. They leave trails. They carve roads. They drain resources. They dig graves. But the Black Banner armies left none. No supply lines, no encampments, no treasure. They appear, they burn, they erase, and they vanish, as if the earth itself swallowed them whole. Some scholars, those few who dare to whisper, suggest that these were the campaigns of the Ashen Throne itself. Not wars of conquest, but purchase ritual movements designed to erase populations, to burn clean the soil, to leave behind not cities, not kingdoms, but silence. And in that silence grew stories. Peasants told their children of nights when the horizon turned black with riders, of hearing the sound of marching feet, but seeing only a shadow that stretched too long, of banners that drank the moonlight so that stars above dimmed when they passed, of villages where no dogs barked, no roosters crowed, because all living things fell mute before them. Later, these memories decayed into fairy tales. Children were warned not to wander at night, lest the black flag that eats the wind find them. Tales of faceless soldiers who rode horses of ash, who left no prints in mud, who could only be escaped if you hid your face and spoke no word. In some regions, the sight of a crow's shadow falling across a doorframe was said to mean the banner passes tonight. But for historians, the question remains: if these campaigns were real land, the ruins, the mass graves, the silences suggest they were then, what were they for? No empire rose from their wake. No dynasty claimed victory. No parchment sealed the triumph. Were they training marches designed to prepare some hidden army? Were they purges intended to cleanse lands of populations we no longer remember? Or were they something stranger, still processions meant not to conquer, but to erase? The chronicles hesitate. The folklore trembles. The soil remembers. And so, the Black Banner campaigns remain one of history's most dreadful enigmas. Wars that no one recalls fighting. Soldiers that left no graves. Banners that bore no crest. An empire's shadow moving silently across centuries, leaving nothing but ash, silence, and questions. If the Black Banner campaigns were shadows in motion, then what followed was emptiness, whole landscapes hollowed out, as though life itself had been pulled from the soil. In the 1100s, records from Saxony, from Hungary, villages documented in tax rolls, in feudal tithes, in the carefully inked ledgers of abbots and counts, suddenly vanish. Entire populations erased between 1 year and the next. The handwriting of the clerks is almost casual. In one roll, the name of a settlement is followed by a neat list of families, their dues, their obligations. In the next year's entry, nothing. The name struck out, or left, untouched, but blank, beside it. As though the clerk himself could not explain why the place had fallen silent. Sometimes a brief note, no longer owing, or simply deserted, but the soil says otherwise. Excavations in these regions reveal not the slow rot of abandonment, no rotted beams, no sagging huts, no gradual retreat. Instead, they show sudden breakage. Pots shattered, looms left half-woven, bread still blackened in clay ovens, tow not faded. Not faded, and around the edges of the villages, the same ash that clings to the ruins of the dust cities clings also here. Ash without firewood, ash without cause. The chronicles are hesitant, but the oral traditions are less shy. Peasants in Saxony whispered of riders without sound, columns of horsemen who moved like mist. No hooves struck the earth, no wheels groaned. They came in the night, without warning, without torches, and when they left, the village was gone. Not destroyed, not burned, not even looted, simply gone. One tale, preserved in the borderlands of Hungary, tells of a boy who hid in a granary loft when the riders came. He claimed they did not enter as men do. He swore the soldiers passed through walls as if the timber itself dissolved before them. He remembered the black banners trailing above them, yet not fluttering in the air rather. They clung to the ground, dragging across it like shadows. When dawn broke, the boy crawled down, only to find his village silent. Every hut empty, every hearth cold. He wandered for 3 days before collapsing in a monastery courtyard. The monks wrote that he spoke no word more, only shook as though still hearing hooves that made no sound. The phenomenon was not isolated. Across a span of decades, tax rolls show entire regions emptied, tens of thousands of people simply erased, and yet no refugee trails, no wandering survivors. In a world where movement left marks pilgrims, filling roads, armies carving paths, merchants marking maps, these vanished populations left nothing. The land bore scars, though farmers avoided the sites where villages had stood. They swore the soil was cursed. Fields where once wheat grew thick now sprouted only tangled weeds. Wells turned foul overnight, and animals, when driven to graze near the abandoned hamlets, grew restless and sick. The saying took hold in these regions: the ground eats men, the ground eats beasts. And always the whisper of connection, that these vanishings were not random, that they were the silent harvest of the Ashen Throne. Scholars who attempt to map the disappearances see something uncanny. The villages that vanished often fall along arcs, the same curved lines traced by the Black Banner campaigns a generation earlier, as if the armies had passed once to burn and again to take. But take what? Some suggest the populations were enslaved, carried away in silence to fuel some hidden empire. Others claim they were sacrifices, blood offerings to sustain a throne not of this world. A more chilling theory argues they were not taken anywhere at all, that they were erased, not relocated. That the riders of Ash did not carry their victims into another absence. And so, folklore grew in the wake of silence. Parents warned children never to stare at black cloth hung in the wind lest the banner see them. Villagers hammered iron spikes into their door frames, believing the soundless riders could not cross iron. In Saxony, it was said that if your shadow fell across abandoned soil, the riders would come for you in the night, mistaking you for one of the lost. The chronicles, again, remain hesitant. Monks write carefully, speaking of lands gone fallow, or people lost to hunger, pestilence, or flight. But their margins tell another story. Notes scribbled in smaller hand, as if meant for no eye but God's. One such note reads, "They were taken by the banners. God forgive us, we saw them." And yet silence. No crusade was called against this threat. No kings marched to reclaim the vanished. No pope thundered against the riders. History looks away, and the empty fields are left to weeds. The vanishing populations remain a scar without a body, a wound without blood. They remind us that not all empires conquer by blade or fire. Some conquer by subtraction, and in the emptiness they left, the silence thickened.
The emperor with no name. Every empire has its rulers. Rome had Caesars. Byzantium had Basileus. Even the Mongols had their Khans, names etched in terror. But the empire of Ash, the shadow between our histories, holds no name. No single ruler survives the manuscripts. No genealogy, no dynasty, no sequence of heirs. Only titles, only fragments. In Saxon glosses, he is Der Ashen Kaiser, the Ashen Emperor. In Byzantine scraps, Hosiopon, Basileus, the Silent Sovereign. In scattered Latin notes from cloisters, Rex Nullius, the King of None. And yet, in none of them, a name, not even the faintest syllable. This silence is more than absence, for in medieval chronicle tradition, even enemies were named. Chroniclers named Saracens, Huns, Mongols, Turks. They named kings and rebels, usurpers and heretics. To leave a ruler nameless was unthinkable, unless the name itself could not be written. One Byzantine account, hidden in the margins of a psalter, dares to describe him: he who sits upon the throne of burning wood that does not turn to flame. A paradox in words. A throne carved of ash-black wood, eternally smoldering but never consumed. A seat that glowed in ember light but never gave heat, never decayed, never turned to dust. The throne itself, an impossibility, Yet one chronicler swore he had seen it in vision. But visions are not kingship. Where are the deeds, the laws, the proclamations of this emperor? Here lies the strangeness. All accounts of the Ashen Throne's rule are indirect. Scholars note the armies, the vanishings, the ruins, but no decrees, no treaties, no signatures, and still the people whispered of an emperor, the nameless figure behind the shadow. The folktales vary. In Saxony, it is said he had no face, only a veil of smoke where features should be. In Hungary, peasants whispered that his voice was heard in dreams, commanding migrations, ordering abandonments. In Byzantium, some monks claimed the emperor never spoke at all, only raised a hand, and armies obeyed. But the consistency is this: he was not named. Some scholars of the 19th century, digging through medieval fragments, suggest this was deliberate erasure, that scribes struck out the name to protect themselves, as if writing it was perilous. Others argue there was never a name to begin with, that the figure behind the throne was a symbol, a construct, never a man. Yet one cannot ignore the persistence of certain phrases. A Latin fragment from Monte Cassino, heavily blotted with ink, reads, "He was no man, but a remainder." A Byzantine monk wrote of a sovereign whose crown is ash and whose kingdom is silence. And in the Chronicles of Worms, we heard first of a kingdom where night never ends, a second note appears. Their emperor is none, and yet all bow, so who or what was he? Some theories hold that the emperor was a succession of rulers, each erasing his own name, so that the throne itself became the sovereign, not the man. Others suggest he was a shadow of memory, an echo of the old Caesars, remembered in a distorted form. But the most chilling possibility is that there never was a human sovereign at all. That the armies who marched without torches, the riders of ash who erased villages, were guided by something less than human and more, a principle, a void, an emperor who was not flesh, but absence itself, enthroned in fireless flame. The folklore deepens this dread. Parents warned children never to whisper a ruler's name in playlist, the Ashen Emperor here, and claim them. In Saxony, men swore that when smoke rose in the distance without fire, the emperor was passing unseen. In Hungary, the phrase "to bow to none" did not mean freedom, it meant servitude to the king of none. But the strangest testimony comes from a Greek chronicler, writing after the First Crusade. He insists that some crusaders traveling east spoke of meeting an army, unlike Saracens, unlike Turks. When asked who they served, the soldiers had one answer: "We march for the emperor who has no name." And when pressed further, they only bowed their heads, as if silence itself was their oath. There is something in this silence, this refusal of names, that resists explanation. In medieval thought, to name was to bind, to name was to record, to give permanence. Saints had names, martyrs had names, even demons bore names. A nameless emperor is unthinkable unless he was outside the order of history itself. And so, the Ashen Throne remains an enigma, a seat of power without identity. A sovereign who commanded armies, erased villages, shaped landscapes, and yet left no name for the world to hold. Perhaps this is why his empire dissolved into silence. Empires of men are remembered because men hunger for memory, for legacy, for glory carved in marble. But an empire of absence needs none of that. Its ruler is faceless, nameless, eternal, not in monuments, but in oblivion. For the peasants of the 12th century, that was enough. To them, he was not a man, nor a king, but a fate, the fate that erased their neighbors, the fate that left fields barren, the fate enthroned upon smoldering wood that never burned. The emperor with no name was less a ruler than a reminder that history itself has shadows and that some thrones are not meant to be seen.
History, for all its gaps and erasures, is rarely silent. Even in the darkest centuries of Europe, monks bent over parchment, scratching annals line by line. Harvests, eclipses, deaths of kings, small wars, births of saints, and yet 1177 stands apart. Across Christendom, a strange absence. Dozens of monasteries, Benedictine, Cistercian, Augustinians suddenly stop writing. Their chronicles, which should run seamlessly from one year into the next, fall silent, not for days, not for weeks, for nearly 2 years. Entries resume in 1179, often with odd apologies. We resume after absence, but no reason is given. No plague is mentioned. No war, no fire in the scriptorium. Only a void. Historians today dismiss it as coincidence. Lost vellum, pages stripped for reuse. The disruptions of travel, the accidents of time. That is the orthodox view. And yet, when one gathers the fragments, a pattern emerges. The lost years cluster around the heart of Europe. From Saxony to Lombardy, from Burgundy to Hungary, the silence echoes. In some cases, pages are not missing but blacked out, ink poured over entire leaves. Others remain intact, but blank as if the monks began to write and then stopped, unable to continue. What could silence so many pens? Peasant memory holds a different answer. Ballads, preserved in fragments, sing of the year when the sky turned black. Not from storm, not from eclipse, but from something worse. One Saxon rhyme, preserved by folklorists centuries later, whispers, "The crows would not land, the bells would not ring, the cattle lay rotting, and the dead filled the spring." These are not the words of history. They are the words of trauma, crystallized in song. In Hungary, stories were told of rivers choked with corpses, not slain in battle, but carried downstream, thousands, nameless, swollen, eyes eaten away. In Lombardy, there were tales of cattle who died standing, their flesh rotting from within, their hides sloughing off while the bones remained upright. No plague known to man behaves so. And everywhere, the same refrain. The sky blackened for days. What could blot out the sun across a continent? Volcanic eruption, some scholars suggest so. Yet no Icelandic sagas, no Arab astronomers, no Chinese court records mention such an event in 1177. Nature records eruptions faithfully in ash layers, and there is none for that year. No, the darkness seems confined to Europe like a pall cast not by earth, but by will. And this is where the chronicles grow uneasy. A single marginal note, written in trembling hand in the Abbey of St. Gall. It was the Emperor S. March. The Ashen Throne again. If the black bannering armies marched in those years, then their campaign was not small. For silence, this vast silence that swallowed monasteries, peasants, kings alike, could only follow devastation across entire regions. But why no record of battle? Why no names of foes? No lists of slain? Perhaps because the foe was not foreign. Perhaps the foe was the people themselves. Villages taken in the night, as earlier tales said, but now not one or two, not Saxon hamlets or Hungarian fields, but whole valleys emptied. The Empire of Ash, in its last great act, cleansing the land of memory. The silence was their weapon. Where armies left fire, the Ashen Throne left nothing. No victors boast, no losers lament, no charters, no treaties, only gaps. Even the church, strongest keeper of words, bent to it. Their pens halted, their parchment lay blank. In later centuries, scholars would try to fill the void. They would invent causes, pestilence, famine, a fever of the monks. But the songs remain. The peasants remembered, and the ballads never lied. The sky blackened. The rivers carried the dead, and history itself fell mute. The year of the Great Silence, the last campaign of the nameless emperor. The moment when an empire that was never written left its final trace by erasing all traces. And when the monks began to write again in 1179, they did so quietly, as though waking from a nightmare. Not one of them dared to name what had happened. They only resumed, as if nothing had passed. But in the fields, peasants still told their children, "Beware the Black Year," the year the world went quiet. And perhaps, if we listen closely enough, the silence still hums beneath our histories.
History ends in silence, but sometimes silence ends in a single scream, one final eruption before it all falls still. For the Empire of Ash, that scream is remembered only as the last war. Archaeology tells us more than chronicles here. In the forests and flatlands of modern-day Poland, scattered across valleys near the Vistula and the Oder, excavations have uncovered what can only be described as a battlefield of staggering scale, tens of thousands dead, their bones intermingled in shallow, mass-like trenches. Yet what strikes most is not the number, but the nature. Skulls shattered, ribs splintered, pelvises crushed. Every bone tells of violent death, but no weapons lie among them. Not swords, not arrowheads, not spear points, no shields, no helmets, no torn mail, only the bodies. It is as though the battle consumed its weapons, along with its warriors. The soil is darker there, heavy with iron, not from tools, but from blood. Radiocarbon tests place it around the late 12th century, the very same period as the Great Silence, which suggests that while pens halted in monasteries, while peasants sang of black skies and rivers of corpses, here in Poland, the last stand was fought. But who fought whom? There is no answer. No medieval chronicle records an army of that size marching east or west. No kingdom mourned such a loss. No dynasty collapsed. It is a battlefield without a history, a war without a memory. Folklore, as ever, fills the void. In Silesia, peasants once spoke of the Ashen Gate, a place, a valley, a ravine, a pass, depending on the teller, where the Empire of Ash tried to breach into the heart of Europe, not by conquest of castles or cities, but by some vast convulsion, as if the earth itself were the gate. One story claims a tower of stone stood there, blacker than basalt, its doorway yawning like a furnace. The riders of Ash marched toward it, bearing their black banners. Behind them, silence spread like a tide. Ahead of them, the gate. But the gate did not open. The earth shuddered. The skies darkened. And when it was over, there was nothing. Nothing except the dead. Tens of thousands strewn across the land. Armies that had marched without heraldry, now lying faceless in shallow pits. Their banners gone. Their weapons gone. Their names gone. Another legend tells it differently. It says the Ashen Throne itself was brought to the gate, the emperor seated upon it, the throne smoldering but never burning. The attempt was not to conquer Europe, but to enter it fully, to pass from shadow into history, to leave behind the half-world of silence and become flesh of empire. And Europe resisted. Some say the monks' silence was not fear, but prayer, that the church itself rose in ritual against the nameless ruler. Bells rang across Christendom, not recorded, but remembered in echo. And at the Ashen Gate, the sound broke the march. The throne cracked, the army fell, but no bell is unearthed there, no chalice, no cross, only bones. Still others insist it was no human defense at all, that the gate was never meant to open, that it was a passage between worlds, and when the emperor forced it, both he and his legions were swallowed. The battlefield is not of the slain, but of the discarded. The gate consumed them, then spat their corpses back, emptied of weapons, emptied of identity. Whatever the truth, this was the end. After 1177, the chronicles resume. Monks write again, kings reign again, wars are fought and recorded again. The silence lifts, Europe continues, but the Empire of Ash, the black banners, the nameless emperor, the vanished villages, is gone. Their last campaign ended at the Ashen Gate, their final act not remembered but buried. The land remains uneasy. Even today, farmers in those valleys speak of bad harvests, of oxen that will not plow the old fields. Some claim to hear cries beneath the soil, not of men, but of banners flapping with no wind. Archaeologists still dig bay, still find bones. They still find skulls with no weapons near them. They catalog, they measure, they publish papers with cautious titles. Mass gravesite in Lower Silesia, 12th century, but none dare name it for what it is, because to name it would be to admit there was a war that should not exist, and perhaps, even worse, that the gate is not yet closed, that the Empire of Ash failed to enter, but waits. Waits patient beyond the veil until another silence falls, and then, perhaps, the gate will open again.
History is not simply what happened. It is what was written. And just as ink can preserve, it can also destroy. If the Empire of Ash truly existed, its fortresses rising in forgotten valleys, its armies marching under black banners, its emperor sitting upon a throne of burning wood, then why is it not remembered? The answer may be that it was remembered, but deliberately erased. In monastic archives scattered across Europe, curious gaps appear. Prayer books from the 12th and 13th centuries sometimes contain odd smudges. Margins overwritten, pages thick with ash where no candle should have burned. The main text speaks of Christ, of saints, of salvation. But the margins whisper. A monk in Worms drew faint black lines that seemed to suggest banners, only to blot them out with holy script. Another in Santiago wrote of the armies that passed without name, but hid the phrase beneath a psalm. In Venice, a codex was found with entire leaves missing. Torn, scholars say, because the hand of error strayed into heresy. But was it error or memory? The church had a weapon more powerful than any sword: silence. Declaring a thing heretical was to exile it not only from the page, but from the mind. Once condemned, no monk would dare copy a chronicle that spoke of the nameless emperor. No scribe would risk his soul by sketching the ashen throne. The safest act was to burn. And so they burned. A chronicler of Mainz is said to have written 50 folios on the kingdom beyond the gate. Only 3 survive. Fragments hidden in the binding of another book, used as scrap parchment. The rest consigned to flame. By the 14th century, even the whispers fade. What had been faint memories became superstition. What had been superstition became folklore. And what had been folklore turned into silence. Why this effort? Why bury an empire so completely? Perhaps the church feared it. If the Empire of Ash was real, then it stood as proof that another power, not divine but shadowed, had rivaled Christendom in its own age. To remember, it was to admit the world was not entirely under God's order. Better to erase, to cleanse the page, to insist history ran smoothly from Rome to the Middle Ages, without an empire of silence interrupting the flow. But erasure is never perfect. Memory has a way of clinging. Scholars note odd marginalia in unexpected places. Serpentine symbols next to prayers against temptation. Notes of black riders in lists of tides. Even the absence itself becomes a sign. 2 years missing from monastic registers. This is not a void. This is a suppression. And, like all suppressions, it trembles with the truth beneath. When we ask, why don't we know of them today? The answer may be, we were not meant to know. The Empire of Ash may not have been forgotten by accident. It may have been forbidden. A kingdom locked not only beyond the gate of time, but beyond the gate of history itself. And yet, here and there, a fragment survives. A torn page, a scorched note. A psalm rewritten, but not entirely erased. Enough to remind us that what is buried is not always gone, and what is erased can still return. Even now, centuries after parchment turned to dust and chronicles to ash, there are places in Eastern Europe where no farmer dares to plow, no shepherd dares to pasture, no pilgrim dares to pray. They are not marked on maps. They have no signs, no ruins for tourists to photograph. And yet, the locals know them well. A hill where the grass grows too thick, hiding stones that should not be there. A valley where mist lingers even at noon. A stretch of forest where they say no birds sing. To scholars, these are curiosities. To the peasants who have lived beside them for generations, they are warnings. They call them the Ashen Fields. They whisper that if you sleep there, you will not wake. Folklore persists. Old women murmur of horsemen that appear during eclipses, their banners not of color but of shadow, black cloth that moves against the wind, hooves that make no sound, riders who do not breathe, who do not speak, who simply pass. And when they pass, wells go dry, livestock sicken, and infants will not stop crying. The rational historian dismisses this as myth, but myths do not emerge from nothing. Myths are the sediment of memory, the residue of events too terrible or too strange to survive in the clean lines of official history. Perhaps the empire was not destroyed at the Ashen Gate. Perhaps it was not erased by fire alone. Perhaps it was folded into the fabric of forgetting, allowed to dissolve into folktale so that the world might continue without its weight. And yet, what dissolves does not always disappear. Fragments endure, blackened stones that farmers stack at the edges of their fields, but never touch with their bare hands. Bones turned up by plows that are quickly reburied without prayer. Charcoal deep in the soil of valleys that have seen no fire for 1,000 years. The empire's legacy, then, is not in monuments or chronicles, but in absences, in gaps on maps, in silences where voices should be, in lullabies that mothers sing without remembering why the words frighten them. It is sleepless, because once you learn of it, you cannot unlearn it. Once you glimpse its shadow, you begin to see it everywhere. In the missing years of the chronicles, in the ruins without builders, in the graves without battles, in the songs without origins. What is history? We are taught it is memory. But perhaps history is also forgetting. Perhaps the truest stories are the ones we are forbidden to keep. The Empire of Ash, whether real, imagined, or something in between, teaches us this. History is not always what is remembered. Sometimes it is what is hidden. Sometimes it is what is taken away. And sometimes it is what refuses to die. Even now, when the sky darkens and the fields fall silent and no birds sing, some claim you can still hear the riders passing in the distance. Not an army anymore, but an echo. A legacy that lingers, sleepless, waiting for memory to falter, waiting for silence to break, waiting for the world to remember what it tried to forget. The Ashen Throne has no monuments, no epics, no crowned kings in our textbooks, but perhaps it has something greater. It has the silence of history itself. And silence, once broken, is eternal.